All right, creating the Constitution. For this lesson, we are going to talk about a little review on the Articles of Confederation, Constitutional Convention of 1787, and the parts and principles of the U.S. Constitution. Real quick review. Articles of Confederation. There we go. Boom. Written in 1777, adopted in 1781. Like we talked about last time, it took about 3 or 4 years between the writing and the adoption to get going. Remember, the war didn't end, the Revolutionary War didn't end until 1783. So they were still operating under the old Continental Congress system prior to the Articles of Confederation. State sovereignty was the founding principle. All the states wanted to be sort of their own countries, but recognized they needed to band together for certain things, such as foreign policy. One of the things that made it so difficult was every state had a veto. They could veto whatever they wanted. Just like today, the president has a veto. In these days, the states themselves could veto whatever was going on. And there was 3 to 7 congressmen selected by state legislatures who could be recalled by the state legislatures at will. So, for instance, we have congressmen today. There's no way to get rid of them except to wait it out and vote them out if something happens. If somebody goes off the rails, the only way they can be expelled from Congress is if Congress expels the members themselves. All right, some things that were good here. States could approve extradition, meaning if you committed a crime, you couldn't run next door. You couldn't go over to a neighboring state and avoid prosecution for that crime. As you remember, they couldn't impose a tax. They could just beg. They could beg states for money. But otherwise, the states didn't have to give the national government any kind of money. There was a proposal to tax imports coming into the country so that the national government could make some money, but it was never ratified. And as you remember, the Northwest Ordinance, that was one of the big pros to the Articles of Confederation. It listed, among other things, a way for states to get into the Union, which still exists today. One of the things it caused by not being able to make money was inflation. States themselves issued their own currency, and they tried to print their way out of debt. Didn't really work. And then, of course, Shea's Rebellion. If you remember, he was a Revolutionary War Continental soldier. After the war, he didn't get paid, but everybody was still trying to collect debts on him. So he got a group of people together, and they were going to kick or to release people from debtors' prisons. Back in that time, you could go to prison if you didn't pay your debts. He was going to release them. He was going to shut down courts that were putting people into debtors' prison, and he was going to march on the legislature. At the end of all that, they ended up getting, they were able to vote their own people into the legislature. The poor farmers were, rather than just the rich merchants. This called a convention in Annapolis, a year prior to the Constitutional Convention, to address some of the issues of the Article of Confederation. They realized that their tiny little convention wasn't going to be able to handle all the issues, so they called for a greater constitutional convention to meet the next year. Again, originally was supposed to just fix the Articles of Confederation. However, due to the problems with the Articles of Confederation, they decided to just start over, scrap the whole thing and start over again. One of the controversies at Philadelphia, at this time, Philadelphia was the capital. One of the controversies was how the states were going to be represented in the new Congress. Small states wanted to keep their vote, 1 vote per state, whereas the large states wanted many votes per state based on population. This, of course, would lead to large states being able to control the small states. And there was a compromise pushed forward by Connecticut, one of the states at the time. Created a bicameral, meaning 2-chambered, two-chambered legislature, one with the House that was represented by the people, the population picks how many representatives in the House are going to be, and then the Senate, which is based strictly on states. How many states? You get 2 senators per state. Another issue they were looking to address was that of a dictatorship, meaning ultimate rule, absolute power found in a single person. They didn't just because they were dealing with King George III, who was trying to take back power from Parliament and ruled pretty much as an absolute ruler over the colonies. They looked at dictatorship as a bad thing. So some of the ways that they were trying to work through that is through a separation of powers, meaning different parts of government have different powers. They don't have overlapping or similar powers or the same powers. Checks and balances, meaning each branch could block the other. Delegated powers, that's a list of things that the government can do. And if it's not listed, they're not supposed to be able to do that. Federalism, meaning there's different levels of government. And we'll get into that later, but we have this federal government, state governments, and local governments. And reservations of powers. These are powers held by the state that the federal government can't run over, can't take away, can't usurp. All right, one of the things that came up with the Constitution is a preamble. This comes up because there's multiple preambles to some of the amendments. And a preamble is just an introduction. It's an introduction or summary of what's going to happen, but is not part of what actually happens. So this is the preamble to the Constitution. This guy's name, Governor Morris, that was his actual name. That's not just an old-timey spelling for a governor. His name was governor. So it says, we the people, the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, one of the ideas was you can't get perfection, but you can be more perfect. The Articles of Confederation weren't perfect. You're not going to get to perfect, but you can move in that direction. You can move in the direction of perfection. They wanted to establish justice. Remember, justice means fairness. Justice doesn't mean equality. You get what you need, not the same thing. That's not always the same thing as everybody else. Ensure domestic tranquility. Domestic means in your home. So in this case, it means within the Union. Tranquility means peace. So peace amongst the states, peace within the states. Provide for the common defense. They're going to defend the borders, promote the general welfare. This one's kind of vague. Nobody really knows what that means, what the general welfare looks like. The ideas of what that is have changed over time. And secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Ourselves is us. Posterity means future generations or children. Post meaning after us. So some of the preambles in the Bill of Rights in the Second Amendment, and this has been confirmed or affirmed by the Supreme Court, that this first part of the Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary to secure the free state. This is a preamble. This is the reason the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. This is the right that's being secured. This is telling us why that right is being secured. It's the preamble. In the Fourth Amendment, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. And the way that won't be violated is that no warrant shall be issued, but upon probable cause, meaning a cop just can't get a warrant from a judge for any reason they want. They have to have some kind of knowledge that a crime is being committed. And describing the place to be searched or the persons or things to be seized. You can't just get a blanket warrant to go on a fishing expedition. You can't just get a warrant to search a house for whatever you might find. It's got to be for a specific thing. So the authorities have to have some knowledge of some crime and a person or a place or a thing where that might have specific person, place, or thing where that might have existed. They can't just say, yep, that guy's committed a crime and I'm going to figure out which one it is. So the basic way the Constitution is laid out, Article 1, legislative branch makes all laws. So the Article 1 describes the legislative branch and their purpose. So you got the House, you got the Senate, number of representatives based on the population of the state. Yep, 2-year term. Yep, must be 25 years old. All right, Senate represents the states, or at least they were supposed to represent the states. The 17th Amendment kind of changed all that, but the Senate supposed to represent the states, state interests, not populist interests, not the people's interest, the interest of the states. And then the executive branch enforces all those laws, but it also represents the interests of the United States in foreign affairs. A big part of the president's duties is to be the top foreign dignitary to the rest of the world. Article 3, judicial branch, the Supreme Court and other lower courts. Article 4 lays out the rights reserved by the states, what they're supposed to do. Article 5 talks about how to change the Constitution. That's happened 17 times. There's 27 amendments, but remember the first 10 came in a batch. So the Constitution has been changed 17 times since its initial ratification. Supremacy Clause, Constitution is the highest law in the land. There's no other law that's higher. There's no treaty. There's no other authority higher that or in the United States. And Article 7, this one was temporary, and it just tells us how the Constitution was to be ratified, which it was. So this is no longer appropriate. So federalism, how federalism works, you have different levels of government. Federal government, national government, population, and geography, right? So it's got the national defense, all the borders, takes care of interstate trade, banking rules for the entire nation, stuff like that. Anything that deals with the population as a whole or our borders, making the geography. States, they handle most laws, right? Murder, theft, marriage laws, etc. There is no federal murder law except in the territories. So if you kill somebody in Florida, you don't have to deal with the FBI. You deal with state police, sheriffs, that kind of thing. If you kill somebody in Washington, D.C. or Puerto Rico or on an Indian reservation, then you're dealing with the feds because that's under federal control. State control has state laws, federal control has federal laws. And then the local, that's your roads, sewers, schools. So on the way to school or on the way in there's all that construction going on. That's got nothing to do with the federal government. It doesn't even have to do with the state government. That's all local. It's the locals that are making you late for school. All right, separation of powers. It's similar to federalism, but it's across the same plane where federalism works vertically, separation of powers works horizontally. So you have the legislative branch in the domestic. Remember, domestic means in-house, within the homeland. They create the laws, and then the executive enforces those laws, and then the judicial settles disputes arising from the enforcement of those created laws. On the foreign, that means outside the United States. We'll go here, executive branch, they make the treaties, right? It's the president and his team who goes around the world and makes treaties with all the other countries. But it's the legislative branch which approves those treaties, and it's the judicial branch which tells us what those treaties mean, whether they break US law, whether they violate the Constitution, that kind of thing. Some different checks and balances. The legislature, they can actually check themselves. They can block themselves because laws have to be approved by both houses or both chambers of Congress. So the House could vote on a bill and the Senate could just never vote on it, and then it goes nowhere. So that's one way the legislature can check itself. Legislature can check the executive through impeachment. We saw that twice in the past year, where the president was impeached but not convicted. They can override a veto. Veto means nullify. Veto means cancel out. The Senate appoints. So the president appoints different members of the government, and the Senate has to approve it. They also have to approve the treaties. They have to ratify the treaties. And the legislature controls the budget. The executive spends the money. The legislature tells the president how to spend the money. Legislature can check the judicial through impeachment. You can impeach judges. The Congress can impeach judges. They can abolish the courts, and they can rearrange the courts as far as jurisdiction goes. And they can check the states through laws, through enforcement. The executive, president, they can check Congress through a veto. Can't check themselves. And the way they work with the judicial is the president appoints judges, and then the Senate approves those judges. And then the president can also pardon. So even if a court convicts someone of a federal crime, the president can overrule that conviction and pardon them. And that happens fairly regularly. And then usually at the end of a presidential term, it happens a lot. There's usually a few dozen pardons that come through at the end of a president's term. And the president can issue executive orders telling how regulations are going to impact states. Judicial review. The judges, judicial branch, Supreme Court, they have this thing called judicial review, where they can review laws, review regulations to see if they're legal. And if they're not legal, they can kick them back and nullify them. Their salary is constitutionally protected, so Congress can't give them a pay cut. And they're a lifetime appointment, so they can't be voted out or replaced. Same thing there. And states, they can review state laws. There's been several state laws that have been deemed unconstitutional. And the states, they pick who the senators are. At least that's the way it used to work. Now with the 17th Amendment, the people pick who the senators are. The states can call for a constitutional convention and completely get rid of the federal government. And they can also nullify certain laws. They can just ignore them until there's a ruling. It's not really anybody to enforce something like that. Same thing, nullification, constitutional convention. They could hold a convention. They can make an amendment to the Constitution that just outlaws the executive branch, puts everything back in Congress, creates a parliamentary system. Same thing with judicial, and states can check themselves. If you don't like the state you're living in, you can just get up and leave. You can move to another state. It's happening quite a bit in California. And everybody's moving to other states, Texas, Colorado, Nevada. So those are some of the ways, the checks and balances that the government has against itself, both on the federal level as well as the state level. So federalism as well as checks and balances balance each other out so that the government doesn't get too out of hand. But what happens if it does get out of hand? How do the people themselves, this is dealing with the government, how do the people themselves check against the government? Well, we've had this idea of these 4 boxes of liberty. This is a very old idea, almost as old as the nation itself. First instance can be found going all the way back to 1830. So 200 years ago, there was a US senator who used a variation of this as his campaign slogan. He called it the 3 boxes. Soapbox had kind of been added on just within the last 40 years or so. But it's a way that the people can check the government. Soapbox, it's First Amendment. Comes from back in the day. People would stand on the street corner and talk about politics or religion. but they would find a way to get themselves above the crowd so they could be seen and heard. One of the ways to do this was they would stand on top of a crate that was used to ship soap. So that's where the soapbox come from. This is your First Amendment right to speak out against the government. And you remember that was a big deal during the Revolutionary War, where pamphlets were issued and circulated against the government, against King George, and Parliament as well. So Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, right? So that's our First Amendment right. Ballot box. This is your voting booth, right? You have the right to vote, and you can, with that, you can change who your representatives are in government. So the right of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied. This comes from this is wording from the 14th Amendment. So this is part of our Constitution as well. Part of our security, and it checks us against the government. Every 2 years, the entire House of Representatives is up for a vote. Every 2 years, 1/3 of the Senate. Every 4 years, the president is up for a vote. So that's one way we can do it. Also through the jury box. We have the right to sue the government. Congress shall make no law abridging the right of the people to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Petition in this sense means sue. If the government has wronged you, you can sue the government to get that fixed. You can take them to court. You can use the legal system. You can use the government's legal system against the government. And this is First Amendment. And this again, or due process, that's a clause in the Fifth Amendment. And what due process means is all available legal options must be exhausted. And this is why if you catch someone coming into the country illegally, you can't just send them straight back to where they came from. You have to go through the court process. Once they're in America, they're subject to the same due process clause, which means the government has to go through all legal options before denying liberty. And then the final box is the Cartridge Box. If you remember this guy, this is in Lexington. This is kind of a generic Minuteman statue, but it's in Lexington. Cartridge Box means the ammo box, means bullets. We just spent the last few weeks, but at this time we had just come out of a revolution where we instigated armed rebellion against an oppressive government. That's the Declaration of Independence. This is where this comes from. When a long train of abuses reduce them under absolute despotism. Despotism means tyrannical, overburdening, oppressive government. It is a right, it is their duty to throw off such a government. Governments don't like to be tossed off, so you have to do that through force. And that's the reason for the Second Amendment, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So moving forward, these three, like I said, 1830s, 200 years ago, moving forward to just after the Civil War, another point where arms were taken up against the government. This guy, Frederick Douglass, he was a runaway slave back in the time, wrote a book. We'll talk about him in future classes right around the Civil War time once we get to that. But he talked about this boxes of liberty concept. He said, a man's rights rest in three boxes: the ballot box, jury box, and the cartridge box. Let no man be kept from the ballot box because of his color. That's the 14th Amendment. Let no woman be kept from the ballot box because of her sex. And that's the 19th Amendment. So he had these ideas in his head as well. Like I said, it's not a new concept, and it represents all our the checks that we can have against a future government or against an oppressive government. All right, if you have any questions, go ahead and leave them in the comments.